This week on Dialogue, Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guest. Robin Wright has reported from 140 countries for a variety of publications, including the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Atlantic. She is a United States Institute of Peace Senior Fellow and a Wilson Center Distinguished Scholar. Her latest book about the region of the world she's covered for 4 decades is Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World. And Robin, got to start with the title. It's a great title. And, I was planning to ask you about it, and then I read in the second to last paragraph the origins of the title. But since our viewers and listeners don't know, I'm going to ask you the question anyway. Where did the title come from?
Rock the Casbah was a song in 1982 by the British band The Clash.
I'm tempted to sing it, but that would be bad.
Well, and one of my colleagues at the Wilson Center, Rob Litvak, came up with the idea when so many of us were looking for one concept, one term that would bring together the political upheavals with the cultural change, with the U.S. policy issues. And the minute he said Rock the Casbah, we knew that was it.
Yeah, it works. I mean, it's really interesting because it's fun, but it's also accurate in many ways. Let me ask you, let's backtrack before the book and talk a bit about your long-standing interests in the region and in Islam. Where did it develop? How does someone become the type of expert that you've become?
Well, it's one of those many accidents of life. I, as a young reporter, was dispatched to the Middle East. And I happened to land on October 6, 1973, which was the day the Fourth Middle East War broke out. Mm-hmm. And once you've been to the Middle East and become enmeshed in its politics, its turmoil, and the kind of existential issues on all sides, you can't help but stick with it.
And then the timing of the book is almost uncanny. There's so much research and interviews and people you met over the years that go into this. You must have been working on it for quite some time, but it almost seems like you hurried up and got it done now because of the moment in history.
Well, that's right, but it was timed really to come out for the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And the idea was to look at what's happened in the Islamic world in the decade since this transformative event, not only for us, but for the whole world, but particularly for Muslims. And so I had spent 2 years traveling the Islamic world to try to talk to Muslims. What were the ideas? What kind of changes had taken place? And many of the kids I talked to in Egypt then went on and led the revolution or the uprising. And so we decided let's try to get it out a little bit early. But the whole idea was to capture this moment. And as I was trying to tell people, look, there's a lot happening in this region. And, there's always the skepticism. And this time, I was right.
You say the kids. Talk about the demographics of the Islamic world. We're talking about a really young group of people on the rise.
The Islamic world, 1.57 billion people are witnessing a baby boom unprecedented. And the demographics really tell much of the political story.
So this is a story of generations as much as a story of anything else.
It is, and you look at a place like Saudi Arabia, and that captures it alone, where the average age is in the mid-20s. Mm-hmm. But the average age of a cabinet minister is 65. The king is 87, and the next two in line for the throne are in their late 70s or early 80s. So we're not talking just about a generation gap, we're talking about 2 and 3 generation gaps between the rulers and the ruled. And I think that's what we see play out to a large extent, to some degree, in literally every country.
Another bit of demographics we should clear up. I think that many people mistakenly, when they think of the Islamic world, think of exclusively the Middle East, or they think of the Arab world. Yeah. And can you set the record straight? Tell us about those numbers.
Absolutely. The Arab world is 300 million out of the 1.5 billion people. It's actually not among, there's no single Middle East country that's among the top 5 most populous Islamic states. Indonesia, Pakistan, India, where Muslims are a minority, but they're still such a large population that they make up one of the 5 largest. There are growing Muslim communities in unlikely places like among Australia's Aborigines and in the Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. So the Islamic world also has a very large presence now in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America, and always had in Africa.
Nothing monolithic about this world
That's
that we're
right.
talking about. This, the conventional wisdom for many has been that this is a world that has been resistant to history's forces and to the change that you see happening in other parts of the country. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks and months certainly corrects that notion. Talk about that as well, about what is happening right now, why now. These things don't happen overnight, so clearly forces have been stirring for quite some time to reach this point.
I actually think that what we're seeing happen in the Middle East is part and parcel of an historic trend that's played out over the last quarter century or so, with the demise of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, with the collapse of apartheid and minority rule in Africa, the end of military dictatorships in Latin America. We're seeing a transformation and empowerment that is unprecedented. Most of the others happened in the late 20th century. The uprisings in the Middle East are the most powerful wave so far in the early 21st century, part of a continuum. But they reflect, the timing reflects a number of factors. One, the demographics, the fact that the majority of young people, including women for the first time in that region, are educated. There's still large percentages of uneducated or illiterate, but many have gone through primary school, high school, can read and write, and for the first time have aspirations beyond daily subsistence, beyond women simply rearing children. They want to have a more dynamic, integrated lifestyle. Then you have the tools of technology. In the mid-1990s, Al Jazeera was the first satellite station for news, 24 hours, that created an alternative to state-controlled media. Today you have over 500 satellite stations just in the Arab world. And so for a lot of different reasons, there was a confluence of factors that generated this unprecedented wave of uprisings.
And to be clear, the significance that you assign to this, in the book you talk about this being number 4 in a list that includes the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War II, the creation of Israel after World War I, creation of Israel after World War II, and then the Iranian Islamic Revolution. And you think this is of that same significance? This is number 4 in the list.
I think that this is when you look at the last century and what were the defining moments in changing the borders and creating modern states with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, with security issues, and now, and again, the dynamics, the flashpoints in the region changing with the creation of Israel after World War II, and then the Iranian Revolution introducing Islam as a political idiom, changing the whole world's political spectrum, but particularly in that part of the world. And now you have people demanding empowerment, and it's in many ways also the 4th phase of the Islamic revival, in that the first 3 waves, 70s, the emergence of political Islam, the 80s, the use of extremist tactics, militant tactics, and the suicide bomb. In the 90s, you saw the beginning of Islamist parties running for office and sharing power with, even in places like Egypt, with the traditional long-standing rulers. And in the past decade, we've seen for the first time a kind of proactive. It's not reacting to whether it's the Arab-Israeli conflict or foreign troops or international policy. It's this, for the first time, people are trying to take their fate in their own hands.
That's a big sea change, because what the region had been defined by is a reaction to usually foreign meddling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You talk about how autocrats and extremists fed off each other, even though they often were in opposition on the ground, but that they had this perverse symbiotic relationship. Could you describe how that worked?
Well, the 2 political forces in the region for so long were the autocrats, many of them now geriatrics, who had ruled for a quarter century or several decades, and who had banned all liberal democratic parties kind of in the center. And so that led to the rise, particularly of Islamic extremists. And the 2 would feed off each other. The regimes would say, look, if it's not us, it's going to be Islamic extremists. And the extremists said, look, we're the only viable alternative to autocracy. And so they have survived. What's so stunning about the current dynamic is this explosion of parties, young people and activists who are not motivated by ideology, who are not defining themselves in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that they're literally looking for just the basics that everyone else in the world wants. Right to determine your political leaders, free speech, free assembly, protection of minorities. And so that makes them a whole new kind of political presence in the region.
This confluence of the stars in alignment, young people, new communications technologies, globalization, and how it gives us a look into each other's lives in a way that can be either a motivator or a source of anger. But one of the things that is striking about this, and you tell the story in here, one of my favorite things about the book is all the interesting characters we meet and how well you tell their stories. And it's, you know, the combination of being a scholar and a journalist makes you a terrific storyteller in that regard. But what has become a very famous moment in December of 2010 in Tunisia, this notion that one person can be a catalyst for changes that sweep across the globe. Recap that story for us, as you do in the book.
Well, Mohamed Bouazizi was a young Tunisian street vendor, and the main source of support for his mother, his ailing stepfather, and 5 siblings. And he was harassed by a government inspector, a woman actually, who, as often happens in many of these Arab societies, was demanding a bribe over a permit issue. And the going rate is 10 dinars or $7.
$7 US, yeah.
And which could be what someone made in a week, a month, you know, it's.
Right.
And so this $7 doesn't sound like much, but it was for someone in that economic category. And so they had a confrontation, and according to the local reports, two people came and backed her up and confiscated his produce as well as his electronic scale, which is his only tool in his trade. And he tried to seek recourse by going to various government offices, was constantly rebuffed. So he went to the governor's office and set himself on fire. And this was not the first time an act like this had happened, but this one was seen by several people. And the family then went to the governor's office afterwards and threw coins saying, "Here's your bribe, here's your bribe." And that demonstration was captured on a cell phone video, was passed around. It mobilized people in ways that had never been seen before in Tunisia, spread, and within 30 days, a man who had ruled for 23 years, President Ben Ali, was forced to flee the country to Saudi Arabia.
In 1 month. And he tried some corrective actions, visited the man at his bedside in his deathbed, made some attempts, but it all unraveled in 30 days.
And not only that, but gave several speeches to the nation. Yes, we'll deal with the economic issues that are troubling you. We're going to help this remote town where Bouazizi set himself on fire. We're going to open up politically. We'll have elections. I won't run again. And it gradually unraveled till there was no alternative.
Was Bouazizi ever conscious enough to know what he had unleashed?
I don't think so. And
that's unfortunate.
The pictures of him make him look like a mummy. He's so totally covered. I don't even think that when the president and his entourage went in to see him that he was aware.
Something 90% of his body burned. Horrific. And then the dominoes spread to Egypt, and you tell the story of the significance of the battle for Lovers Bridge. Tell us about that, please.
This was day 4 of the challenge to the rule of President Mubarak in Egypt, and it was quite a scene. There's a famous bridge in Cairo where young couples, particularly the lower classes, go on the night of the weekend, which is Thursday and Friday in the Islamic world. And they stroll up and down, and they're flower vendors. And
you wrote that they canoodle, which is a great word. I love it.
Yeah. And I've often gone there to kind of taste the political waters, literally on the Nile, of where people
just to get a feel for the zeitgeist at the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I know that bridge very well, and it is on the route to Tahrir, or Liberation Square. And there was a very dramatic scene where on a Friday, people marched from different points of town and met at Lovers Bridge to walk across to Liberation Square. And they were met there by Egyptian security forces. And there was a prolonged battle where the police fired tear gas and rubber bullets and so forth. And the crowd kept being pushed back, but they'd nudge forward. They'd get down in the prayer position so that the water cannons would not, knock them over. Police pushed them back initially, but they came back, and they came back with all kinds of protection. The cloths soaked in vinegar to protect them against the tear gas. They came with shields. They even took some guard stations and moved them in front so that they wouldn't be hit. And within a few hours, they pushed the police back, and the police then disappeared. And that was the critical moment when the Egyptians saw that they too could do what the Tunisians had done.
This was not going to be easy. Just brute force was not going to turn the tide. People would not be discouraged. Throughout your stories, Twitter, Facebook, the internet emerge over and over again. One of the people you spoke to called it Revolution 2.0. Can we underestimate or understate the importance of the internet in all of these things that you write about?
Well, there are a lot of arguments about what role really did Twitter and Facebook play in all of this. But in a country like Tunisia, where the government has such total control of the internet and censorship, it could not censor Facebook. And with 20% of the Tunisian population on Facebook, this was really a way of getting the word out. And not only that, but once, because of the cell phones that loaded videos, Al Jazeera was trolling Facebook, looking for videos, and picked up some of the ones after Bouazizi's self-immolation and the protests that began. And they started then using those Facebook videos as well. So the word went out to the whole region. So you can argue that the majority may not be on the internet like we in the United States are, but a large enough percentage that once you generate that large an audience, and then by word of mouth, then you pick up with satellite stations, that there's a chain of events that makes it impossible for these regimes that once controlled television, radio, newspapers, to hold back.
And Al Jazeera's role, in the past, or not in the past, in the present, many people view Al Jazeera in the United States as an anti-U.S. bias. But you depict them in the book as certainly an important cog in this wheel that has made it possible for people in the region to share information in ways that in the past they could not.
And they do it in Arabic, so that they don't need to know English to listen to, whether it's the BBC or CNN, that this is in their own language and gives so much more time than any of the Western news outlets do to what's happening.
And nothing lost in translation.
That's
as
right.
a result. The declining support for violent jihad you write about as counter-jihad. Explain the term and how jihad is being redefined.
One of the things that was so interesting to me was this common thread that it was not just the rejection of autocrats. There's also today in the region something we don't take or fully understand, and that is the rejection of extremism, not just Al-Qaeda, but the radical ideologies that say you have to stand up to whether it's the West or Christianity or Judaism or kind of the ideas that dominate or prevail in so many parts of the world, and that people are actively now trying to take the concept of jihad back, redefine it as originally defined as the struggle to be a good, practicing, faithful person, whatever their faith. And so the counter-jihad was a concept I came up with to capture both dynamics. And it plays out in a lot of interesting ways, not just in the street uprisings, but in cultural ways as well.
Let's talk about some of those. There's some fascinating aspects of the book. We were talking before we began recording about stand-up comedy, but tell us about film, playwrights, poetry, comic books, the
and
99,
hip-hop.
Hip-hop, rap. Give us some insight into some of these characters you met and what they're doing.
Well, one of the most interesting stories is about hip-hop Islam. Rap today is the rhythm of resistance in the Arab world and in the larger Islamic world. In Tunisia, a month before the young street vendor set himself on fire, a rapper, 21 years old, put a song on his Facebook page because the government did not allow hip-hop on state-controlled media, didn't allow them to perform publicly or to record. And so this was his only way of putting his words out. And the song was incredibly anti-regime, spoke directly to President Ben Ali, charged whether it was corruption, failure to address rising unemployment, particularly among the young, education problems, talked about the garbage in the streets, the poverty of a growing number of people. And that song became the anthem of the Tunisian Jasmine Revolution, as they call it. Jasmine is the national flower, and was sung in Egypt and Little Bahrain as well.
You also talk about this television program, a reality program, Millions Poets, sort of the American Idol of the region. Talk about that as well.
Well, one of the interesting parts of the Arabian Peninsula, the most conservative corner of the Islamic world, Saudi Arabia and the Little Sheikdoms, is that music is kind of banned publicly, except for sword dances that the men use in so many of these places, particularly Saudi Arabia. And that their reality competition is poetry. And there's a Millions Poet competition held every year. And last year, one of the 48 poets from 12 countries selected to compete was a woman, totally covered in what they call niqab, which is the black robe, the black headdress, and she had only 2 small slits to show her eyes. And she got up and delivered a poem that was stunning for that environment.
It was politically charged.
It was politically charged. Most of the time, the poems are safe, you know, flowers and desert life and soccer or sport. And she spoke about the chaos of fatwas. Fatwas are edicts by clerics, and of course a great source of controversy because radical clerics issue fatwas about justifying extremism and killing. And hers was against the clerics who issued these fatwas, against radicalism in general, and then finally against her own brethren for not doing more to counter extremism. And she gradually made it through the competition until she was in the finals, in which she did a poem about freedom of thought. And at the end of the competition, there were 6 finalists, and she came in 3rd. But she was better known. The
most famous of the finalists.
And people did not know still what she looked like, but they had heard her voice. And this is a program shown to millions of people across the region.
Speaking of fatwas, you talk about bin Laden, and even before his death, how he was falling from grace. One of the people you talk about, say Al-Qaeda is the equivalent of the KKK here. It exists, but it's not prominent or significant even. But in the counter-jihad you write about, you talk about how clerics began issuing fatwas in defiance or in complete contradiction to what bin Laden had been saying.
Well, one of the dynamics in the last really 4 or 5 years has been the emergence of clerics who once worked with Al-Qaeda or bin Laden or were seen as models.
In some cases directly.
Directly, absolutely. Dr. Fadl, who was the ideologue of Al-Qaeda, who was in exile in Sudan with bin Laden and his successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, defected and actually, after writing what had been the manual for Al-Qaeda, turned around in the last few years and wrote a total denunciation from a prison cell in Egypt, but it was deemed as credible. It was a product of what they call the prison debates, where many of the militants began debating, does violence work? Is it counter to Islamic thought? There was another Saudi sheikh named Salman al-Odeh who had been the model for bin Laden, and he turned against bin Laden as well and renounced him. So that there has been, I call it the big chill. This was a moment when within Islam itself you had people who had once been part of the militant movement or supported it turning against those who were militants themselves.
You write that what is happening is only the beginning of the beginning.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, change takes a long time. And we see that when we look at what's happened in the last generation. 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, you still have a former communist and former KGB spy chief in power. In South Africa, many blacks are tragically worse off today than they were under apartheid. For economic reasons, they have the vote, but they don't live better. They have not seen the fruits of freedom. And we are kind of spoiled. We think that in 18 days, a mighty country like Egypt can fell a ruler who's been in power for 30 years. And so the next day they'll have democracy. It doesn't happen.
The morning after problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned Putin, and you say that there are three groups in play here, right? And tell us who they are, that as we figure out what the new order will be. Those old holdovers from the old regimes, like Putin, who else?
Well, you have the ancien regime, which still has, even if the parties have been disbanded, they know how to do it. They have the resources, they have the networks, and they're the ones who...
The wealth, too.
The wealth, yeah. Exactly, to be able to mobilize new parties and run candidates again.
And then the protesters.
And then there are the protesters, who are the weakest of the three different categories. They may have the most energy, the most dedication, but they don't have the resources.
They cause the change, and they're the ones least prepared to exploit it.
And they don't have the political parties. They're very small time frames to develop platforms, find candidates, campaign, get a name out there. And so they are the most vulnerable, even if on the streets they have a lot of power.
And the third group?
And the third group are what are generally known as the Islamists. And this has its own whole spectrum. There are groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which have been around for decades, renounced violence in the 1970s, ran for political office openly in the 1990s, were the largest opposition group in parliament, even under Hosni Mubarak. They're one faction. And then on the other extreme, you have the people that I'm much more worried about, who are the Salafists, the Salafis, who are the most conservative, the most radical. They may have renounced violence, but they're still looking for the most rigid interpretation, are not enthusiastic about whether it's Christian minorities, other ethnic minorities, or women participating in political systems. And so, you know, we tend to lump them all together, but the interesting fact is that there are a whole range of different elements.
Well, and however the story breaks, we know you'll be on it, and so we look forward to having you back and talking about more. Robin, this is a terrific book. Congratulations. Quite an accomplishment, and I know it's going to be well received. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
This is the book, and you've just heard from the author. Rock the Casbah. Robin Wright is the author. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.